Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Last year, 47 hikers went missing in Appalachia. Most were never found, but 6 people made it back. Tonight, they're breaking their silence about the forbidden trails, about what chased them down the mountain. These aren't campfire tales. This is their warning to you. Subscribe now, hit that like, share with your friends, and tell me where you're from. The sun's going down. Time to hear what hunts in the dark. I'm 38 years old, and I've been running my food truck, Mountain Eats, through these hills for the better part of 6 years now. Started the business after the textile plant down in Morganton shut down and took half the county's jobs with it. My grandmother always said the mountains provide for those who respect them, but she never told me they might demand something in return. Been serving hikers mostly, folks coming off the Appalachian Trail, day hikers from Charlotte looking for an adventure, college kids who think they're tougher than these old ridges. Good people. Hungry people, and they pay fair for hot food after days of eating trail mix and lukewarm creek water. I learned the business from my Uncle Carlos, who ran a lunch truck for construction crews before his heart gave out. He taught me that hungry people don't care about fancy, they care about full. My usual spots were the popular trails around Pisgah and Nantahala, places where the parking lots stay busy and cell service keeps you connected to the world. But the real money, I'd started hearing, was up on the old trails. The forgotten places where the serious hikers finish their week-long treks through country that hasn't changed much since my great-grandfather's time. These folks stumble out of the woods looking half dead, and they'll pay premium prices for the first real meal they've seen in days. That's how I heard about Devil's Fork Trail. The name should have been warning enough. My grandmother used to tell stories about places in these mountains where the Cherokee wouldn't hunt, where even the old-timers from her generation wouldn't set foot after dark. But when you're trying to make truck payments and keep a business running, you start thinking with your wallet instead of your gut. The ranger who issued my permit was Tom Briggs, a mountain man in his 60s who'd been working these forests since before GPS was even a dream. His family's been in these hills for generations. The kind of people who know which hollers run cold even in summer, which ridges the animals avoid. When I told him I wanted to take my truck up to Devil's Fork for a weekend, something shifted behind his eyes. "You sure about staying up there alone?" he asked. And the way he said it made my skin crawl. Not like he was worried about bears or weather, like he was worried about something specific. I told him I'd been doing this for years, knew how to handle myself. Bears, drunk hikers, equipment failures. I'd dealt with it all. But Tom just shook his head slow, like he was weighing something heavy in his mind. "My grandfather used to trap up that way," he said finally. "Stopped going after 1952. Never would tell me why, but he'd get this look in his eyes whenever someone mentioned Devil's Fork. Same look my daddy got when the topic came up. He stamped my permit, but his hands were shaking slightly. You call in every morning and evening on the radio. Every morning and evening, you hear me? And if something feels wrong, anything at all, you get out of there fast." The drive up took me 3 hours on roads that got narrower and rougher the higher I climbed. Old logging roads mostly, carved into the mountainside decades ago and left to fight their own war against the weather. I had to stop 4 times to move fallen branches, and twice I wasn't sure my truck would make it up the steeper grades. The trees pressed in close on both sides, old-growth forest that filtered the sunlight down to almost nothing. Every mile felt like I was driving deeper into a world that didn't want me there. But when I finally reached the Devil's Fork trailhead, I understood why hikers spoke of it in hushed tones. The parking area sat on a natural shelf of rock, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by hemlock and white pine that must have been growing when my ancestors first crossed these mountains. Below the shelf, the land dropped away into a valley so deep and green, it looked like a bowl carved out of the earth itself. The trail markers were old, hand-carved wooden signs, black with age and weather. One pointed toward the main trail, another toward something called Crying Woman Falls, and a third, smaller sign simply read, Old Settlement, 2 miles. I spent Friday afternoon setting up what I called my full mountain operation. Portable propane grills, prep stations made from folding tables, coolers packed with fresh meat and vegetables I'd bought that morning in town. By evening, I had everything ready for what I hoped would be the best business weekend of the year. The first night passed quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest. No night birds calling, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed muted, like the forest was holding its breath. I made myself dinner on one of the grills, watched the sun disappear behind the western ridge, and tried to shake the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. Saturday morning brought my first customers right on schedule. A group of 4 college kids emerged from the trail around 9, looking like they'd been through hell and back. 5 days on the trail, they told me, coming down from the Appalachian Trail connector. They ordered everything I had, cooking, plus extra bacon, and paid me with crumpled bills pulled from the bottoms of their packs. "Best thing we've ever tasted," one of them said through a mouthful of scrambled eggs, and I believed him. More hikers trickled in throughout the day, couples who'd been married 20 years and decided to hike the ridge to celebrate. A solo woman in her 50s who'd been section hiking the AT for the past decade. Even a family with teenagers who'd tackled a shorter trail as a bonding experience. Every one of them hungry. Every one of them happy to pay premium prices for hot food. Every one of them grateful to find civilization at the end of their wilderness journey. By late afternoon, I was already planning to add Devil's Fork to my regular rotation. The business was exactly what I'd hoped for, and the setting was so beautiful it made the long drive worthwhile. I was cleaning my grills and thinking about a cold beer when everything started going wrong. The first customer I couldn't quite figure out appeared just as the sun was disappearing behind the trees. At first glance, it looked like another hiker. Tall, lean figure walking out of the forest where the main trail emerged. But as it got closer, something felt off about the way it moved. Too fluid in some places, like its joints weren't quite right. Too stiff in others, like it was learning how to walk. And it was pale. Not just white, pale, like something that had never seen sunlight, like milk left too long in a cellar. "Food," it said when it reached my setup. Not, "Do you have any food?" or "Are you still serving?" Just food. I figured it was some local person, maybe someone with a medical condition or developmental issues. These mountains have families that have lived here for generations, some of them pretty isolated, some of them pretty strange. The Cherokee used to say these hills could change people if they stayed too long in the wrong places. Plus, the person was holding money. A $20 bill, though it looked older than any currency I'd seen recently. "Sure, what can I get you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice friendly. The person, I still couldn't tell if it was male or female, pointed at everything on my prep table. The raw hamburger meat, the buns, the condiments, even the napkins and aluminum foil. All, it said. I cooked up the meat I had left, figuring this person was just really hungry. Maybe they lived way back in the hills and didn't get to town often. I'd heard stories about folks like that, families that lived almost completely off the grid, came out of the mountains only when they absolutely had to. But when I handed over the food, what happened next made my stomach turn cold. The person ate everything I'd given them, but not like any human I'd ever seen. They opened their mouth unnaturally wide and swallowed the hamburger meat whole, no chewing, like a snake taking down prey. Then they ate the buns, the pickles, the mustard packets, including the plastic packaging. When they finished the actual food, they started eating the napkins I'd provided. Then the aluminum foil I'd wrapped everything in, just crumpled it up and swallowed it like candy. "More," they said, looking at me with eyes that seemed too large for their face, too dark, like looking into deep water at night. I told them I was out of food for the day, but they just stood there staring. That's when I heard it, footsteps coming through the forest. Not the regular rhythm of hikers, but something irregular, like whatever was walking didn't quite understand how feet were supposed to work. More figures emerged from the tree line. 6 of them, then 8, then more than I could easily count, all with that same too tall, too pale appearance, all moving with that same fluid, wrong-jointed gait. And all of them looking at my food truck with an intensity that made every survival instinct I'd inherited from generations of mountain people start screaming. "Food," the first one said again, and this time the others repeated it in a chorus that didn't quite sync up. "Food, food, food." They surrounded my setup in a loose circle, and I realized with growing dread that they all had money. Old bills, tarnished coins, even some currency I didn't recognize. But none of it looked like they'd earned it working normal jobs. Some of the bills had dark stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. One of the creatures was holding a wallet that still had photos in the clear plastic windows, pictures of a young man with a hiking pack, smiling at the camera with mountains in the background. The wallet looked familiar. I'd seen that same smile earlier in the day. That's when it hit me what I was looking at. These things weren't just strange customers. They were predators. And the money they were paying me with had come from the hikers they'd caught. My hands were shaking as I started cooking again, partly because they were paying customers, and I didn't know how to refuse, partly because I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't feed them. Every instinct told me to run, but they had me surrounded, and my truck keys were in my pocket. If I made a sudden move, I had no doubt they'd be on me before I could reach the driver's door. I grilled everything I had left: hot dogs, chicken breasts, the last of the hamburger meat, and watched in growing horror as they consumed it all the same way the first one had. No chewing, just swallowing whole. And always trying to eat the packaging, the utensils, anything that came with the food, like they didn't understand the difference between nourishment and container. As the night wore on, more of them kept appearing from the forest. They seemed to understand the concept of payment, but the evidence kept piling up about where their money was coming from. Credit cards, hiking watches, even a GPS device that was still beeping softly in one creature's oversized hands. Personal items that hikers would never willingly give up. Around midnight, when I was completely out of food and starting to panic about how to make these things leave, one of them did something that nearly stopped my heart. It reached into what I'd thought was a backpack and pulled out a rabbit. A live rabbit, eyes wide with terror. The creature bit the animal's head clean off and swallowed the entire thing, bones, fur, everything, without even seeming to notice the blood running down its chin. The others watched this display with what I can only describe as approval. Then they all turned to look at me with those two dark eyes, and I understood that I was looking at my own future. They'd been using my food truck as a convenient feeding station, but now the easy food was gone. I could see them calculating whether it would be easier to hunt more hikers or just eat the food truck owner who'd been serving them all evening. I backed slowly toward my truck, trying to keep my movements casual and non-threatening. But the creatures followed, closing their loose circle tighter around me and my equipment. The largest of them, something that might have been male if it had ever been human, stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice had an odd echo to it, like sound bouncing off the walls of a deep cave. "Teach," it said, pointing at my grills and prep tables with fingers that were too long and ended in what looked like claws. "Teach what?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Cook," it said, "teach cook." That's when I realized these things had been watching me all night, studying me, learning from me. They wanted to know how to prepare food themselves. They wanted me to stay and show them how to turn their hunting into something more sustainable. They wanted cooking lessons. For the next 2 hours, I gave the most surreal and terrifying cooking demonstration of my life. I showed them how to light the propane burners, how to season meat, how to flip burgers without burning them. They were quick learners, but they got everything wrong in small, crucial ways that made my skin crawl. They'd hold the spatula upside down, or try to season the meat after it was already cooked, or attempt to flip food with their bare, clawed hands. Every time they made a mistake, they'd look at me expectantly, waiting for correction. And every time I corrected them, they'd nod with that same unnatural fluidity and try again. It was like teaching children, if children were 7 feet tall and ate live animals whole. But while I was teaching them, my mind was racing, looking for any advantage, any way out of this situation that didn't end with me becoming their next meal. And that's when I remembered something my Uncle Carlos had drilled into me during my first week on the job. Propane is dangerous stuff if you don't respect it. While showing them how to clean the grills, I quietly loosened the valve connections on both of my large propane tanks. Not enough to create an immediate leak, but enough that the slightest jostle would release gas into the air. I also repositioned several of my smaller backup canisters closer to the main cooking area and adjusted the pilot lights to burn hotter and higher than normal. The creatures were so focused on learning to cook that they didn't notice me sabotaging my own equipment. If anything, they seemed pleased by my attention to detail, interpreting my equipment adjustments as part of the lesson. As dawn approached, I was starting to understand something that made my blood run even colder. These things were intelligent. Not just animal cunning intelligent, but problem-solving, tool-using intelligent. And they were learning human behavior by watching me, trying to figure out how to integrate into our world. If they mastered cooking, they wouldn't need to hunt hikers for every meal. They could make their kills last longer, be more efficient, draw less attention. They could become better predators by becoming more human. When I felt like I'd taught them enough to seem cooperative but not enough to make myself unnecessary, I told them I needed to get something from my truck. They watched me carefully as I walked to the driver's side door, but they let me open it. I climbed in like I was just retrieving supplies, but instead I turned the key and started the engine. The sound made every one of them turn toward me instantly. I could see in their faces that they understood I was trying to leave, and I could see them deciding whether to let me go or add me to their collection of hiking gear. I threw the truck into reverse and floored it, backing away from my cooking setup as fast as I could manage. As I'd hoped, the sudden movement caused both large propane tanks to tip over hard. The loose connections I'd created finally gave way completely, and gas began hissing out in dangerous quantities. The creatures were confused by the sound and smell, clustering around the grills, trying to figure out what was wrong with their new equipment. One of them, trying to be helpful, reached for what it thought was a control knob to fix the problem. It adjusted the flame on one of the burners just as the gas cloud reached critical density. The explosion lit up the entire ridge like a second sunrise. I was already 50 yards away, but the heat still singed the hair on my arms through the open truck window. When I looked back, half of my equipment was scattered across the parking area in twisted, burning pieces. The creatures were thrown in all directions, some of them on fire, others just picking themselves up off the ground, looking confused and very, very angry. I didn't stop to see how badly they were hurt. I drove down that mountain road like the devil himself was chasing me, bouncing over rocks and potholes that probably destroyed my truck's suspension. Every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, I expected to see pale figures running after me with inhuman speed, but the road behind me stayed empty. It wasn't until I reached the main highway and saw other cars, streetlights, the normal world of gas stations and fast food restaurants, that I realized I was crying. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel, and I had to pull over twice to throw up on the shoulder. I drove straight to the ranger station and found Tom Briggs working the night shift, just like he'd promised. When I told him what had happened up at Devil's Fork, he listened without interrupting, making notes on a yellow pad. When I finished my story, he was quiet for a long time, just staring at his coffee like it might have answers. "We've had reports," he finally said, "missing hikers in that area. More than usual for country that rough, but we never found bodies, never found signs of what happened to them." He looked up at me with eyes that seemed older than they had the day before. "Been going on for maybe 2 years now. Started slow, just 1 or 2 people who might have gotten lost or fallen off a cliff. But it's been getting worse." He told me that Devil's Fork had actually been off limits to overnight camping for almost a year, but that the restriction had been quietly lifted recently when the missing person reports stopped coming in. The Park Service thought whatever was out there had moved on to hunting grounds somewhere else. "Looks like they just learned to be more careful," I said. Tom nodded grimly. "Smarter predators are always more dangerous than hungry ones." The Park Service sent a team up to Devil's Fork the following week. They found the burned remains of my cooking equipment and evidence that something large had been living in the cave system near the trailhead. Scratch marks on trees that didn't match any known animal. Bones that had been cracked open for marrow in ways that didn't fit normal predator behavior. But no bodies. No definitive proof of what I'd encountered. The official report listed it as a bare incident with equipment failure resulting in propane explosion. I moved my business back to the main trail parking areas after that. Places with good cell service, regular foot traffic, and ranger stations close enough to reach by radio if something went wrong. I never applied for permits to the remote areas again, no matter how much money I might have made. But the story doesn't end there. About 6 months later, Tom Briggs called me at home. There had been reports from hikers coming off some of the more isolated trails. People talking about a new phenomenon they'd started encountering in the deep woods, cooking fires that burned too hot and too clean. The smell of grilled meat in places where no one should have been camping. And sometimes, if they got close enough to investigate, they'd find crude fire pits surrounded by gnawed bones and scattered hiking gear. "They're cooking now," Tom said, and I could hear the worry in his voice. "Whatever you taught them up there, they're using it." Since then, the missing hiker reports have actually gone down in our area, but they've started increasing in other parts of the state, and in Tennessee, and in North Carolina, always in remote areas, always on trails that don't see much traffic. I still wake up some nights thinking about those pale hands trying to learn how to hold a spatula the right way. Wondering if they figured out what went wrong with my propane setup. Wondering if they learned from that mistake the same way they learned everything else. The worst part is knowing that I made them better at what they do. More efficient, more human. These days, I stick to the day hiking trails, where there are always people around, always cars in the parking lot, always a way to get help if something goes wrong. I've got a good business, regular customers, enough money to keep my truck running and my bills paid. But I'll never serve food in the deep woods again. Some lessons, once taught, can't be taken back. And some students are too dangerous to educate. I still get calls from other food truck operators asking about permits for the remote trails. The money's good out there, they say, real good. And when they ask me about it, I tell them the same thing Tom Briggs told me that day in his office. Some places in these mountains don't want us there, and if we're smart, we'll listen to what they're trying to tell us. My grandmother always said the mountains provide for those who respect them. What she didn't tell me was that they'll also protect themselves from those who don't. I work as an animal control officer for Morgan County, and I'm 39 years old. Been doing this job for almost 15 years now, dealing with everything from loose dogs to the occasional black bear that wanders into someone's backyard. I've always been good with animals. Grew up on a farm about 20 minutes outside Beckley, so I understand their behavior, their instincts. Most folks around here know me by name, call me when they've got a critter problem they can't handle themselves. It's honest work, and I like being able to help people and animals both. My territory covers a lot of rural area, including the trails and camping spots up around Whitewater Creek, which is where families like to take their dogs for hiking and weekend trips. The whole thing started in early October, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the weather was still warm enough for people to spend time outdoors with their pets. I got my first call on a Tuesday morning from a woman named Janet Holbrook, lived about 3 miles from the Whitewater Creek trailhead. She was crying on the phone, which isn't unusual in my line of work. People get real attached to their animals. But what she was saying didn't make much sense at first. "Sarah, I need you to come out here," she said. "Something's wrong with Bailey." Bailey was their golden retriever, about 4 years old, friendly dog I'd helped them register when they first moved to the area. "What kind of wrong, Janet? Is he sick?" "No, he's different. Since we took him hiking on Saturday, he won't eat his kibble, won't play fetch, just sits there, staring at us with this strange look in his eyes." She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. "Sarah, I don't think this is our dog." Now, I've heard a lot of things over the years. People convinced their pet has been replaced by aliens, neighbors swearing someone stole their cat and returned a look-alike. Usually it comes down to stress or illness making an animal act different. But Janet Holbrook was level-headed, had worked as a nurse for 30 years before she retired. Not the type to imagine things. I told her I'd drive out after lunch to take a look. The Holbrook place sits on about 5 acres of mostly wooded land. The kind of setup that attracts folks who want privacy but don't want to be completely cut off from civilization. Their house is a modest ranch-style building with a big fenced yard where Bailey usually ran around, chasing squirrels and barking at delivery trucks. When I pulled up, Janet was waiting on the front porch, arms crossed tight across her chest. Her husband Mike was there too, looking like he hadn't slept much. That was my first real indication something was genuinely off. Mike Holbrook was the kind of man who took everything in stride, never got rattled by much of anything. "He's in the backyard," Janet said before I'd even gotten out of my truck. "We put him out there this morning because, well, you'll see." I followed them around to the back of the house, and there was Bailey. Looked exactly like the dog I remembered. Same golden coat, same size, same white marking on his chest. He was lying under their big oak tree, perfectly still, watching us approach. And immediately, I knew what Janet meant. Something was off about the way he held himself, the way his eyes tracked our movement. Too focused, too deliberate. "Bailey," I called out, using the tone I'd learned works with most dogs. Usually Bailey would come running, tail wagging, maybe jump up on me for attention. This dog lifted his head, looked directly at me, and didn't move. Didn't wag his tail, didn't pant, didn't do any of the things a normal dog would do when a familiar person called his name. "Watch this," Mike said. He walked over to the fence and picked up a tennis ball, Bailey's favorite toy. "Bailey, fetch." The dog stood up immediately and walked, not ran, walked, directly to where Mike threw the ball, picked it up gently in his mouth, and brought it back, dropping it at Mike's feet. Then sat down in a perfect heel position and stared straight ahead. "That's not normal," I said, because it wasn't. Real dogs have personality. They get excited, they might chase the ball, but then get distracted by a smell or another animal. This was like watching a robot programmed to imitate a dog. "It gets worse," Janet said quietly. "Yesterday evening, I was cooking dinner and dropped a piece of raw chicken on the floor. Bailey, our Bailey, would have gobbled it up in 2 seconds. This one just stared at it. But then later, when Mike went to check the garbage cans, there were 3 dead mice lined up on the back porch. Neat as you please, like someone had arranged them there. I spent about an hour observing the dog, running him through basic commands, checking his physical condition. Everything looked normal on the surface. Right weight, clean coat, no signs of injury or illness. But Janet was right. This wasn't the same animal I'd helped them register 4 years ago. This dog followed commands perfectly, never got distracted, never showed any sign of the playful personality that had made Bailey so memorable. "Where exactly did you take him hiking?" I asked. "The Blue Trail up at Whitewater Creek," Mike replied. "Same place we've been going for years. Nothing different about the trip, except..." He looked at his wife. "Tell her about the other dogs." Janet nodded. "While we were up there, we saw maybe 6 or 7 other families with their dogs, all walking the same trail we were. But their animals were acting strange too. Real quiet, staying close to their owners, not doing the usual sniffing around and playing with each other that dogs normally do on hikes. I left the Holbrooks with a promise to look into it, but honestly, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be looking into. A dog acting differently after a hiking trip could be explained by a dozen different things. Encounters with wildlife, eating something that disagreed with him, even just getting older and calming down. But then, I got the second call. 2 days later, around 9 in the morning, my phone rang. Woman named Patricia Mills. Lived about 7 miles from the Holbrooks, but also close to the Whitewater Creek area. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. "Mrs. Mills, you need to slow down and tell me what's happening. It's Whiskers." She managed to get out between sobs. "Our cat. We took him with us camping last weekend, and when we got home, Sarah, he won't stop staring at me. All night long, just sitting in the corner of our bedroom, watching me sleep. And yesterday, I found him in the bathroom, looking at himself in the mirror, but hissing. Like he was angry at his own reflection. Cats can be strange creatures under normal circumstances, but what Patricia was describing sounded genuinely disturbing. I'd never heard of a cat developing a fear of mirrors, especially not its own reflection. Has he been eating normally? That's just it, he won't touch his regular food. But yesterday I found a dead rabbit on the kitchen counter. A whole rabbit, Sarah. Whiskers has never caught anything bigger than a mouse in his entire life. And this thing looked like it had been studied. Like something had been learning how it was put together. I told Patricia I'd stop by that afternoon and spent the rest of the morning trying to convince myself this was all coincidence. 2 families, both reporting behavioral changes in their pets after visiting the same hiking area. Could be a parasite, could be some kind of environmental contamination, could be nothing more than pet owners being oversensitive to normal variations in animal behavior. But when I got to the Mills house and saw Whiskers, I knew we were dealing with something I'd never encountered before. The cat looked exactly like the orange tabby I remembered from previous visits. Same markings, same size, same green eyes. But the way he moved was completely wrong. Too fluid, too controlled. He walked across the room like he was consciously thinking about every step, placing his paws with mechanical precision. And his eyes, they were too focused, too intelligent. When he looked at me, it felt like he was studying me, trying to figure out how I worked. "Whiskers," I said softly, extending my hand the way I'd done hundreds of times with cats. Usually, they'd either come over to investigate or ignore me completely. This cat tilted his head to one side, watching my hand like he'd never seen a human gesture before, then approached with that same unnaturally controlled movement. When he rubbed against my hand, his purring sounded mechanical, not the irregular, emotional rumbling that real cats make, but a steady, rhythmic vibration that felt more like an engine then an expression of contentment. "Patricia, where exactly did you camp?" "Same place we always go. The designated camping area, about 2 miles up the Blue Trail from the Whitewater Creek parking lot. We've been going there for 5 years, never had any problems before." I spent the next week making phone calls, reaching out to other families in the area who I knew owned pets. What I discovered made my stomach turn. 7 different households, all reporting similar changes in their animals after recent trips to the Whitewater Creek area. Dogs that suddenly became perfect at following commands but lost all traces of personality. Cats that stopped playing but started bringing home prey they'd never been capable of catching. Birds that stopped singing but began mimicking human voices with disturbing accuracy. Every single animal looked exactly like the pet the family remembered, but something fundamental had changed. They moved wrong, responded wrong, felt wrong in ways their owners couldn't quite articulate but absolutely knew were real. I decided to investigate the trail area myself, bringing along Rex, my German Shepherd partner who'd been working with me for 8 years. Rex had an excellent nose for tracking and a calm temperament that made him perfect for animal control work. If there was something in those woods affecting domestic animals, Rex would be able to sense it. We drove up to the Whitewater Creek trailhead on a Thursday morning, early enough that we'd have the area mostly to ourselves. The trail was well maintained, marked with blue blazes every 100 yards or so, winding through dense hardwood forest that was just beginning to show its fall colors. Nothing unusual about the environment itself. I'd walked these trails dozens of times over the years, responding to calls about lost hikers or dogs that had wandered off from their families. But about a mile up the trail, Rex started acting nervous. His ears went flat against his head, and he kept looking off into the woods like he was tracking something I couldn't see or hear. Every few steps, he'd stop completely and turn his head, listening for sounds that weren't there. "What is it, boy?" Rex whined softly, a sound I'd only heard him make a handful of times in all the years we'd worked together. He was a confident dog, not easily spooked, but something about this place was making him genuinely uncomfortable. We continued up the trail, with Rex growing more agitated with every step. His hackles were up, his tail held low, and he kept trying to pull me back toward the parking area. About 2 miles in, near the camping area Patricia Mills had mentioned, Rex stopped dead and refused to go any further. That's when I saw the bones. Off to the left side of the trail, maybe 30 yards into the woods, there was a small clearing where someone had been digging. Shallow holes, recently filled in, marked with small piles of stones. It looked like a pet cemetery, except the graves were too fresh, and there were too many of them. Against every instinct I had, I tied Rex to a tree near the trail and went to investigate. The first hole I examined contained the remains of a medium-sized dog, golden retriever. From the looks of the skull and bone structure, the bones had been carefully arranged, like someone had been studying the skeleton, learning how the pieces fit together. The second grave held a cat, the third, a small dog, maybe a terrier mix. 5 graves total, each containing an animal that had been dead for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. All of them showed signs of careful examination, bones separated and sorted, bite marks on some of the larger pieces, like something had been testing the texture and density. I was so focused on the graves that I almost missed the sound behind me. Almost. Rex was barking frantically from where I'd tied him, the kind of alarm bark that meant immediate danger. I turned around and saw something moving through the trees about 50 yards away. At first glance, it looked like a person walking a large dog, but the movement was wrong. Too smooth, too coordinated, like both figures were being controlled by the same mind. As they got closer, I could see that the person was wearing clothes that didn't fit properly, walking with mechanical precision that reminded me of the affected pets I'd been observing. And the dog beside it was moving in perfect synchronization, never pulling on the leash, never stopping to sniff or investigate its surroundings. They were heading directly toward me. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might trigger an aggressive response. The thing that looked like a person turned its head in my direction, and even from 50 yards away, I could see that its face was wrong. Too symmetrical, too perfect, like it had been designed rather than born. Rex's barking intensified as the figures approached the edge of the clearing. The thing wearing human form tilted its head, listening to my dog's distress calls, and I watched its face shift slightly, features rearranging themselves, becoming more familiar. It was copying Rex's appearance, trying to figure out how to look like him. That's when I realized what I was dealing with. Not sick animals, not behavioral changes caused by environmental factors. Something was killing pets in this area, studying their bodies, learning to imitate them perfectly. And now it was trying to figure out how to mimic humans. I ran. Rex was still tied to the tree, pulling against his leash and barking at something he could sense, but I couldn't see. I untied him with shaking hands, and we both sprinted back down the trail toward the parking area. Behind us, I could hear footsteps keeping pace, never getting closer, but never falling behind. 2 sets of feet moving in perfect rhythm, following us at exactly the speed we were running. My truck was still there, keys still in my pocket, Rex jumping into the passenger seat before I'd even gotten the door open. I started the engine and backed out of the parking space as fast as I could manage, not caring about the gravel I was throwing or the dust cloud behind us. In my rearview mirror, I saw 2 figures standing at the edge of the parking area, watching us leave. Even at that distance, I could see they were perfectly motionless, standing side by side like mannequins positioned for display. I drove straight to the county sheriff's office and tried to file a report, but how do you explain something like that? I told Sheriff Martinez about the graves, about the strange behavior in the affected pets, about the figures I'd seen in the woods. He listened politely and promised to send a deputy up to check the area, but I could see in his eyes that he thought stress was making me imagine things. The deputy found the graves, confirmed that someone had been burying animals in the woods near the trail, but the bodies were gone. All 5 holes had been emptied, refilled with plain dirt, no trace of the bones I'd seen just hours before. I stopped taking calls related to the Whitewater Creek area after that, started referring families with behavioral problems to veterinarians in other counties, told people the area was under investigation for possible environmental contamination. It wasn't exactly a lie, but the calls kept coming. More families reporting changes in their pets after hiking trips, more animals that looked exactly like beloved companions but felt fundamentally wrong to their owners, more perfect mimics that followed commands flawlessly but had lost every trace of the personality that makes an animal a family member rather than just a biological machine. 3 months later, I transferred to a different county, told my supervisor I needed a change of scenery, wanted to work somewhere with less wilderness area and more suburban animal control issues. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about those figures in the woods, the way they'd moved together like parts of a single organism. Couldn't stop wondering how many of the pets I'd been asked to check were actually the original animals, and how many were something else wearing their shapes. I still work in animal control, but I've never gone back to Whitewater Creek. When people ask me about good hiking spots in Morgan County, I always recommend somewhere else. Somewhere with more people, better cell phone coverage, places where you're never really alone with just your pet and whatever might be watching from the trees. Rex is retired now, living with me on a small farm about an hour away from any major hiking trails. He's 12 years old, moving slower than he used to, but he's still definitely himself. Still has the personality quirks and individual behaviors that make him who he is, not just what he looks like. Sometimes I catch him staring off into the distance, ears up like he's listening for something. On those days, I make sure all the doors are locked and we stay inside until whatever he's sensing decides to move on. Because I learned something in those woods that I'll never forget. Sometimes the things we love most can be taken away and replaced so perfectly that the only way to tell the difference is by trusting the feeling in your gut that whispers something's wrong. And in my line of work, I've learned to listen to that feeling. I'm 47 years old, and I work for the U.S. Census Bureau. Have for about 8 years now. Most people think it's boring government work, and honestly, they're not wrong most of the time. But what happened to me last spring in the mountains of West Virginia? Well, let's just say I don't look at my job the same way anymore. My name's Robert Hayes, and I specialize in what we call hard-to-count populations. Basically, people living off the grid in remote areas. The government needs accurate population data for everything from federal funding to emergency services planning. So when they assigned me to conduct surveys along Bear Mountain Trail, I figured it would be routine work. I'd done dozens of these rural counts before. The trail runs through some of the most isolated country in Appalachia. We're talking about families who've lived on the same land for generations, folks who might not see another soul for weeks at a time. My supervisor told me there were 15 known households in the area, plus an unknown number of undocumented residents. Standard stuff. I'd go door to door, explain who I was, fill out the demographic forms, and move on to the next place. I drove up from Charleston on a Monday morning in late April. Spring comes late to those mountains, and there was still snow in the shadowy spots where the sun never quite reaches. The trail itself isn't much more than a gravel road that winds through dense forest and opens up every few miles to reveal a cabin or trailer tucked back in the trees. Beautiful country, if you don't mind feeling like you're at the edge of the world. I'd been doing census work long enough to know the drill. Most mountain folks are decent people, but they're wary of government types. Can't blame them, really. I always made sure to dress casual, jeans, flannel shirt, nothing that screamed federal employee. I carried my official credentials, of course, along with my tablet and a stack of paper forms as backup. The government had drilled into us the importance of being respectful, patient, and thorough. The first few houses went smoothly. I met the Kowalski family, 3 generations, living in a well-maintained cabin with solar panels and a vegetable garden. Mrs. Kowalski made me coffee and chatted about how her grandkids were doing in the local school. The Jenkins place was next, a newer modular home where a retired coal miner lived with his wife and disabled son. Normal stuff, the kind of interactions that made this job rewarding, despite the long drives and paperwork. But by Wednesday, I started noticing something odd. When I introduced myself at the third house, the Brennan family's place, the elderly woman at the door looked confused. "You already came by," she said, squinting at my credentials. "Yesterday morning." Asked me all the same questions. I checked my tablet, then my paper records. I'd never been to the Brennan place before. I explained this to Mrs. Brennan, showed her my schedule, but she insisted someone matching my description had already surveyed her household. Same height, same hair color, even wore similar clothes. She'd filled out all the demographic information and signed the forms. "Had to be someone else from your office," I told her, trying to keep it professional. "Sometimes wires get crossed, and we accidentally double up on an area. I'm sorry for the confusion." But Mrs. Brennan shook her head. "No, sir, it was definitely you. Had your name and everything, Robert Hayes, just like on that badge you're wearing." That gave me pause. The Census Bureau keeps detailed records of field assignments. I was the only worker assigned to Bear Mountain Trail. I asked Mrs. Brennan if she still had the forms, and she went inside to look for them. When she came back, she was holding a completed demographic survey with my signature at the bottom. Problem was, I'd never seen that paperwork before in my life. Looking back now, I should have called my supervisor right then, should have reported the incident and asked for guidance, but I figured it was just some kind of administrative mix-up. Maybe a trainee had used my identification number by mistake, or there'd been a computer glitch. Happens more often than you'd think in government work. So I continued my rounds, marking the Brennan household as already completed. The next few stops were normal. A young couple with 2 kids, an old-timer who lived alone with about 6 dogs, a family that ran a small maple syrup operation. Everyone was friendly enough, though a couple of people mentioned they'd been expecting me because word travels fast in small communities. It was at the Morrison place, way up a winding dirt road, that things got really strange. Tom Morrison was a guy about my age who'd moved up from the city a few years back, trying to live a simpler life. He invited me in for a beer, and we talked about the challenges of rural living, generator maintenance, propane deliveries, dealing with bears, getting into garbage, normal conversation. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Funny thing? My neighbor down the valley mentioned you'd been by his place twice now. Said you were real thorough the second time around, asking a lot more detailed questions." I asked him which neighbor, and he pointed toward a hollow I couldn't see from his porch. "The Hendricks family. Old mountain family, been there forever." Jake Hendricks said, "You came by last week asking the standard census stuff, then showed up again a couple days ago with follow-up questions." I pulled out my tablet and checked my records. I'd never been to any Hendricks household. According to my assignment sheet, there wasn't supposed to be anyone living in that hollow at all. Tom offered to walk me down there, said the path through the woods was easier than trying to drive around on the back roads. I followed him along a narrow trail that wound between thick stands of rhododendron and mountain laurel. The air was still and quiet, no bird songs, no insect sounds, just our footsteps crunching on old leaves. The Hendricks place was older than anything else I'd seen in the area. Log cabin construction, probably built in the 1800s, with a stone chimney and a tin roof gone rust red with age. Smoke was coming from the chimney, and there was a vegetable garden plot beside the house, though nothing had been planted yet. Jake Hendricks came out when he heard us approaching. He was maybe 60, with gray hair and the kind of hands that come from a lifetime of hard work. Friendly enough, but he looked at me with this puzzled expression. "Back again, I see," he said. "Didn't expect to see you so soon after yesterday." I explained that I'd never been to his place before, that this was my first visit to the Hollow. Jake frowned and looked me up and down. "That's strange," he said. "Someone who looked exactly like you was here yesterday afternoon, had all the same government paperwork, asked about how many people lived here, what our ages were, medical history, that kind of thing." Medical history wasn't part of the standard census survey. We asked about age, race, gender, occupation, basic demographic information. Nothing about health conditions or family medical backgrounds. Tom Morrison looked as confused as I felt. "You sure it was the same guy, Jake?" "Positive," Jake said. "Same face, same voice, even had the same little scar on his chin." He pointed at a small scar I'd gotten from a childhood accident. Only difference was, he stayed a lot longer. Asked questions that seemed more personal than what the government usually wants to know. I asked Jake what kind of personal questions, and he glanced at Tom before answering. Wanted to know about family history going back generations. Asked about genetic conditions, unusual births, children who might not have made it to adulthood. Strange stuff for a census worker to care about. The more Jake talked, the more uncomfortable I got. Someone was impersonating me, using my name and credentials to conduct unauthorized surveys. That was a federal crime, not to mention a serious breach of Census Bureau protocol. I asked Jake if he'd kept copies of the forms he'd filled out, and he went inside to get them. When he came back, he handed me a set of demographic surveys that looked official. Same paper, same format, even the same watermarks. And there at the bottom was my signature, perfect in every detail. But the questions were all wrong. Whoever had conducted this survey had asked about genetic lineages, family diseases, behavioral patterns in children, even questions about local folklore and family stories passed down through generations. None of that was part of any census operation I'd ever heard of. Tom was reading over my shoulder, and I could see he was getting worried too. "Jake, you said this guy looked exactly like Robert here?" "Exactly," Jake confirmed. "Could have been his twin brother." "I don't have a twin brother. I don't have any brothers at all." I thanked Jake for his time and told him I'd report the incident to my supervisors. Tom walked me back to my truck, and we were both quiet for most of the hike. When we reached the main trail, he stopped and looked at me seriously. "Robert, I've lived in these mountains long enough to know when something isn't right. You might want to be careful out here." I asked him what he meant, and he glanced back toward the hollow. Mountain people have long memories and good instincts about strangers. If someone's running around using your identity, pretending to be government, that's going to make folks nervous. And nervous mountain folks. He didn't finish the sentence, but I got the message. I drove back to the little motel where I was staying and called my supervisor in Charleston, explained the situation, read him some of the unauthorized questions from Jake's forms. He was as baffled as I was. "Robert, you're the only field worker assigned to that area. Has to be some kind of identity theft situation. I'm going to contact the FBI field office and see what they want to do about this." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jake Hendricks pointing out that scar on my chin, something only someone who'd studied me closely would notice. And those survey questions. Why would someone want detailed genetic and medical information about isolated mountain families? The next morning, I decided to continue my assigned route while waiting for instructions from Charleston. I figured whoever was impersonating me might try it again, and I wanted to catch them in the act. I drove deeper into the mountains, following a dirt road that wound up toward the ridgeline. The next household on my list was supposed to be somewhere near the end of the trail. The Carpenter family, who, according to my records, lived in an old homestead that had been in their family for over a century. I found the place just before noon. It was set back in a clearing surrounded by old-growth forest, a weathered farmhouse with a wraparound porch and several outbuildings that looked like they'd been built decades apart. Chickens wandered around the yard, and there was a vegetable garden that someone had recently turned over for planting. When I knocked on the front door, it was answered by a woman in her 40s with suspicious eyes and a defensive posture. "We already told you people everything we're going to tell you," she said before I could introduce myself. "My husband filled out your forms yesterday, answered all your questions. We don't appreciate being bothered again." I showed her my credentials and explained that I was conducting the official census survey, but she shook her head. "Robert Hayes, right? Same name as yesterday." "Look, mister, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we cooperated with the government already. My husband spent 2 hours answering questions about our family history, our children, even stuff about my grandmother's medical records. That's more than we had to do." Before I could respond, I heard a man's voice calling from somewhere behind the house. "Mary, who's that at the door?" The woman, Mary Carpenter, I assumed, called back without taking her eyes off me. "It's that census man again, honey, the one who was here yesterday." I heard footsteps, and a moment later a tall, bearded man appeared around the corner of the house. He was carrying a splitting maul, and when he saw me, his expression went from curious to angry. "What the hell are you doing back here?" he demanded. "I told you yesterday, we answered your questions. All of them, some of them twice, because you kept asking the same things in different ways." I raised my hands, trying to defuse the situation. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I've never been to your property before. Someone's been impersonating me, conducting unauthorized surveys." The man, presumably Mr. Carpenter, stopped walking and stared at me. "That's impossible. You're standing right there. Same face, same voice, same government badge." "Did you keep copies of the forms you filled out?" I asked. "Course I did," he said. "Don't trust government paperwork to disappear into some filing cabinet without keeping records." He went inside and came back with a folder full of documents. When I looked through them, I felt that same sick feeling I'd experienced at the other places. These weren't standard census forms. They were detailed demographic and genetic surveys that asked questions no government worker would ever ask. Questions about hereditary traits in the family line. Questions about children born with unusual characteristics. Questions about local legends and stories about different people who'd lived in the mountains over the generations. And at the bottom of every form was my signature. Mr. Carpenter was studying my face while I read through the paperwork. "You really don't remember being here yesterday?" "I swear to you, I've never been here before in my life." That's really strange," Mary Carpenter said. "Because whoever was here knew things about you that a stranger wouldn't know. He mentioned growing up in Huntington, talked about working for the Census Bureau for 8 years, even knew about your divorce. I never told anyone about my divorce during field work. It wasn't professional, and it wasn't relevant to the job. But this imposter had somehow known personal details about my life." "Did he say anything else?" I asked. "Anything that seemed unusual or out of place?" Mr. Carpenter and his wife exchanged a look. "Well," he said slowly, "toward the end, he started asking questions that didn't seem like government business. Wanted to know about the old stories, the family legends. Asked if we'd ever had children born different." "Different how?" "You know, the old mountain stories. Kids born with extra fingers or toes, children who could see things others couldn't, babies who didn't cry like normal babies." Mary Carpenter looked embarrassed. "Silly folklore stuff." But he seemed real interested in it. I thanked the Carpenters for their time and promised to report the impersonation to federal authorities. As I walked back to my truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were tire tracks in the muddy driveway that didn't match my vehicle. But they were fresh, maybe a day old. Someone driving a similar truck had been here recently. I spent the rest of the afternoon visiting the remaining households on my list, and the pattern continued. At every place, families told me they'd already been surveyed by someone who looked exactly like me. Someone who knew personal details about my life, who carried perfect copies of my credentials, and who asked questions that went far beyond standard census protocol. By evening, I was thoroughly spooked. I drove back to the motel and tried calling my supervisor again, but the call went straight to voicemail. Cell service was spotty in the mountains, and sometimes messages took hours to get through. I was sitting in my motel room, trying to make sense of what was happening, when I heard a vehicle pull into the parking lot outside. I looked through the window and saw a truck identical to mine. Same make, same model, even the same government license plates. A man got out of the driver's seat and walked toward the motel office. From behind, he looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, same clothes. When he turned slightly, I could see his profile. It was my face. My exact face. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. The imposter was talking to the desk clerk, probably trying to get a room. I had maybe a few minutes before he might come looking for me. I gathered my equipment and paperwork as quietly as I could and slipped out the back entrance of the motel. My truck was parked on the other side of the building, and I managed to reach it without being seen by whoever was pretending to be me. I drove straight through the night back to Charleston, stopping only when I was sure I had cell coverage to call my supervisor. By morning, I was sitting in a federal building downtown, giving my statement to FBI agents who listened to my story with expressions that grew more serious with each detail I shared. The investigation that followed was classified, but I was briefed on some of the findings. Similar incidents had been reported in rural areas across multiple states. Unauthorized census workers conducting detailed demographic surveys, asking questions about genetic history and family medical records. In every case, the imposter had perfect credentials and knew personal details about the real census worker they were copying. The FBI never caught whoever was behind it, but they shut down the operation. New security protocols were implemented for field workers, including verification procedures that made it harder for someone to impersonate government employees. I was reassigned to urban census work after that. Safer, my supervisor said, though he never explained what we were being kept safe from. I never went back to Bear Mountain Trail, and I never found out what happened to the families who'd been surveyed by my duplicate. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those questions. Questions about genetic lineages and unusual children, questions about family medical histories and local folklore. Someone or something had been very interested in the isolated families living in those mountains. They'd been studying us, learning how to copy us perfectly, gathering information about human populations for reasons I still don't understand. I'm 48 now, and I still work for the Census Bureau. But I stick to cities and suburbs, places with good cell coverage and plenty of witnesses, because somewhere out there, I know there's another Robert Hayes still walking around. And I have no idea what he's planning to do with all that information he collected about those mountain families. I just hope I never meet him face to face. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a certified arborist. People call me a tree surgeon, which sounds fancier than it is. Mostly I climb trees, cut dead branches, and tell folks when their oak tree needs to come down before it crushes their house. It's good work, honest work, and it keeps me outdoors in the mountains of eastern Kentucky where I grew up. My daddy was a logger, his daddy before him, so I guess you could say trees are in my blood. I've been doing this for about 12 years now, ever since I got my certification from the state. Started my own business 5 years back, Anderson Tree Services. Just me and my truck full of chainsaws, climbing gear, and enough knowledge about tree diseases to bore you to tears at a barbecue. Most days, I'm removing storm-damaged branches or taking down trees that got too close to power lines. Nothing too exciting, but it pays the bills, and my wife Sarah doesn't worry about me getting hurt like she would if I'd followed Daddy into the mines. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late September. I remember because Sarah was making her famous apple butter on the stove, and the whole house smelled like cinnamon and cloves. The phone rang just as I was heading out to check on a diseased maple over in Pineville. Woman on the other end said she was calling from the State Park Service, which got my attention right away. They don't usually call little operations like mine. Mr. Anderson, we've got a situation up on Twisted Oak Trail that needs your expertise, she said. Her voice had that official sound people get when they're reading from a script. We're dealing with some unusual tree growth patterns that have our botanists scratching their heads. Now, I've seen plenty of weird things in my years working with trees. Lightning strikes that spiral bark right off the trunk. Disease that makes leaves grow in strange colors. Ice storms that bend saplings into perfect loops. Mother Nature's got a sense of humor sometimes, and trees bear the brunt of it. But when the State Park Service calls you specifically, you know it's something out of the ordinary. Twisted Oak Trail winds through about 15 miles of old-growth forest up in the Daniel Boone National Forest. It's popular with hikers and birdwatchers, though it gets its name from an old white oak at the halfway point that got struck by lightning years ago and kept growing in this twisted, gnarled shape. Kids love to climb it, despite the signs telling them not to. I'd been up that trail plenty of times with Sarah when we were dating. It's beautiful country, especially in fall when the leaves turn. The park ranger, a guy named Mills who I'd met a few times at community events, met me at the trailhead parking lot around 10 that morning. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well, and kept glancing back toward the trail entrance like he was expecting something to follow him out of the woods. "Mike, I appreciate you coming up so quick," he said, shaking my hand. His palm was sweaty despite the cool morning air. "I got to tell you, in 20 years of working these mountains, I ain't never seen anything like what's going on up there." We loaded my gear into his Park Service truck. Chainsaw, climbing equipment, tree health assessment kit, first aid supplies, the usual stuff. As we drove up the gravel access road toward the trail, Mills filled me in on what they'd been finding. "Started about 2 weeks ago," he said, navigating around a pothole that could have swallowed a small car. Hikers began reporting that some of the trees along the main trail looked wrong. That's the word they kept using, wrong. At first we figured it was just folks not used to seeing how weather can affect tree growth, you know? City people come up here expecting everything to look like a postcard. He paused to light a cigarette with shaky hands, despite the no-smoking policy in park vehicles. I didn't say anything about it. Man looked like he needed the nicotine, but then our own people started seeing it. Trees growing in patterns that don't make sense. Perfect geometric shapes, some growing through each other like they're made of water instead of wood. All healthy as horses, mind you, but shaped like something you'd see in a fever dream. We parked at a maintenance shed about a quarter mile from where the weird stuff supposedly started. Mills insisted on walking with me, though I could tell he didn't want to. Professional obligation, I figured. We hiked in silence for a few minutes, just the sound of our boots on the packed earth and the normal forest sounds. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, wind moving through the canopy overhead. Then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, I saw what had everyone so spooked. The first thing that hit me was how quiet it got. Not silent, exactly, but muffled, like someone had thrown a thick blanket over the whole forest. The air felt different too, thicker somehow, with a metallic taste that made my teeth ache. But it was the trees that made me stop in my tracks and just stare. 3 massive white oaks were growing in a perfect triangle, their trunks maybe 15 feet apart. That wouldn't have been unusual by itself. Sometimes trees do grow in patterns that look deliberate. But these trees had grown their branches in perfect spirals, each tree spiraling in the opposite direction from its neighbors, creating this twisted cathedral effect overhead. The branches were healthy, covered in vibrant green leaves despite it being late September. But they were growing in ways that violated everything I knew about how trees work. "Jesus," I whispered, setting down my gear bag. "How long have they been like this?" Mills was hanging back, staying on the trail while I moved closer to examine the trees. Far as we can tell, they grew this way. No evidence of training or human intervention. Rings show normal growth patterns, just shaped wrong. I walked around the triangle, running my hands along the bark. It felt normal, rough, warm from the morning sun, solid. But when I looked up through the spiral branches, my head started spinning. The pattern was too perfect, too deliberate. Trees don't grow in mathematical precision like this without help. "There's more," Mills said quietly. We continued up the trail, and every 100 yards or so, there were new impossibilities. A cluster of young maples had grown their trunks in a perfect square, creating a living wooden room about 8 feet on each side. When I ducked inside, I could see that the branches overhead had woven together to form a ceiling, complete with small gaps that let in dappled sunlight like windows. Further along, an ancient hemlock had somehow grown its roots upward and its branches downward, creating this weird inverted tree that looked like something from a children's book illustration. The roots formed a canopy overhead while the branches dug into the earth below. It was healthy, thriving even, but it was impossible. "Mike," Mills called from ahead, "you need to see this one." I caught up with him at a section where the trail split around what should have been a single large tree. Instead, I was looking at 2 massive tulip poplars that had grown through each other. Not side by side, not intertwined, literally through each other. One tree's trunk passed through the middle of the other's trunk at about head height, creating a living wooden archway. Both trees were perfectly healthy, their bark smooth where they intersected, as if they'd always been part of the same organism. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, thinking maybe the photos would help me make sense of what I was seeing. But the camera seemed to have trouble focusing. Every shot came out blurry, as if the trees were moving even when they clearly weren't. "Mills, how many people know about this?" I asked, lowering the phone. "Too many," he said. "Word's getting out. We've had to close this section of trail to hikers, told them it's due to storm damage. But people talk, you know? Social media and all that. We're going to have every tree hugger and conspiracy theorist in 3 states trying to get up here if we don't figure out what's going on soon." I spent the next hour examining tree after tree, each one more impossible than the last. Some had grown hollow interiors, forming perfect chambers inside living trunks. Others had shaped their branches into staircases and walkways that connected tree to tree like some kind of wooden highway system. The more I looked, the more I realized this wasn't random weirdness. There was intelligence behind it. Planning. It was when I found the tool marks that things really started to feel wrong. I was examining a white oak that had grown its trunk in a perfect spiral, like a massive wooden corkscrew, when I noticed fresh cuts in the bark. Clean cuts, made with a sharp blade, but here's the thing that made my blood run cold. The cuts were made from inside the wood. The blade marks showed someone or something had carved these grooves from within the living trunk. "Mills," I called, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. "How exactly did you want me to help with this situation?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking everywhere except at me. Finally, he said, "The state wants you to cut them down. All of them. They figure if we remove the affected trees, maybe whatever's causing this won't spread." I laughed, but it came out harsh and bitter. "Mills? There's got to be 50 trees along this trail showing these patterns. You're talking about clearing a significant section of old-growth forest. The environmental impact studies alone would take years." "They've already been approved," he said quietly. "Emergency authorization. They want this dealt with fast and quiet." That's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost lost in the background noise of the forest. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. A soft scraping sound, like fingernails on wood, coming from inside the spiral oak I'd been examining. I pressed my ear against the bark and listened. Something was moving inside the tree, something alive. I pulled out my battery-powered drill and fitted it with a long, thin bit used for taking core samples. The spiral oak's trunk was about 3 feet across, so I'd have to drill deep to reach whatever was making that sound. The drill bit sank into the wood easily, too easily. Instead of the resistance you'd expect from healthy hardwood, it went through like the inside of the tree was hollow. When I pulled the bit out, it was covered in a thick, white substance that looked like tree sap, but moved like it was alive. As I watched, the stuff pulsed and squirmed on the metal, trying to crawl back toward the tree. "What the hell?" I started to say, then stopped. Mills was gone. I looked up and down the trail, called his name, but got no answer. His footprints ended at the spot where he'd been standing, as if he'd just vanished into thin air. My truck keys were in my back pocket. We'd driven up in his park service vehicle. I was about 15 miles from the nearest road, alone in a forest full of impossible trees. And that's when I noticed the trees were moving, not swaying in the wind. There wasn't any wind. The spiral oak's trunk was slowly rotating, like a massive wooden screw turning in the earth. The square maples were expanding and contracting their room-like formation, the walls breathing in and out. The inverted hemlock's upward-growing roots were reaching toward me like fingers. I grabbed my chainsaw and yanked the starter cord. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. Tried again, same result. The battery on my drill was dead too, though it had been fully charged that morning. Even my phone was showing no signal and a rapidly draining battery. The scraping sounds were getting louder, coming from multiple trees now. I could see pale shapes moving inside the hollow chambers, pressing against the inner bark like things trying to get out, or maybe trying to get me to come in. I backed away from the spiral oak, hefting my manual handsaw. It wasn't much against whatever was living inside these trees, but it was all I had that didn't require batteries or gasoline. As I moved, I kept my eyes on the nearest tree, watching for sudden movements. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. They looked like larvae, pale, segmented, about the size of a man's forearm, but they moved with purpose and intelligence. They were carving the wood from inside the trees, shaping the growth patterns, directing the branches and roots like conductors leading an orchestra. As I watched, one of them pressed against the bark of the spiral oak, and the tree responded by growing a new branch in the exact direction the creature was pushing. The trees weren't diseased or mutated. They were being controlled, farmed. And these things had been watching me the whole time, learning from my examination of their work. The closest tree, one of the square maples, suddenly expanded its trunk walls outward, trying to trap me in the center of its room. I dove backward, rolling across the trail as branches swept through the space where I'd been standing. The handsaw caught on my climbing rope and jerked out of my hands, clattering away into the underbrush. I ran. Behind me, I could hear the forest coming alive, branches crashing together, roots breaking through earth, and underneath it all, that constant scraping sound of the pale creatures carving new shapes, building something bigger. The trail twisted and turned, but every path seemed to lead deeper into the infected area. Trees on both sides began growing toward each other overhead, trying to form a living tunnel that would trap me inside. My phone was completely dead now, but my watch still worked. It was almost noon. I'd been in the forest for over 2 hours, though it felt like minutes. The sun was directly overhead, but the light filtering down through the manipulated canopy was wrong, tinted green and full of moving shadows. I came to the split in the trail, where Mills and I had first seen the intergrown tulip poplars. The archway they'd formed was smaller now, maybe 5 feet high instead of 6. As I ducked through it, I felt something brush against my back, one of the pale larvae, hanging down from the canopy like a spider on a web. I stumbled forward, swatting at my shirt to make sure it hadn't attached itself to me. The thing hit the ground behind me with a wet slap and immediately began burrowing into the earth, probably heading for the root system of the nearest tree. Within seconds, the branches above started growing downward, reaching for me with wooden fingers. I had maybe a quarter mile to go before I reached Mills's truck, but the trail was changing as I ran. Trees were growing across the path, forcing me to duck and weave between branches that hadn't been there minutes earlier. The pale creatures were everywhere now, dropping from above, emerging from hollow trunks, flowing along the ground like a white tide. One of them latched onto my leg as I vaulted over a fallen log. It felt cold and wet through my jeans, and I could feel it trying to burrow through the fabric. I grabbed it with both hands and yanked it loose, throwing it as hard as I could against the nearest tree trunk. It hit with a sound like a wet towel slapping stone and stuck to the bark, immediately beginning to carve new patterns. The truck was visible ahead, still parked next to the maintenance shed. But between me and it, the trees had grown together to form a solid wall of interwoven branches and trunks. There was no way through. The larvae had been planning this, using Mills as bait to get me deep enough into their territory that escape would be impossible. But they'd underestimated one thing. I'd been climbing trees since I was old enough to walk. I pulled my climbing gear from my belt, rope, harness, ascenders, the tools I used every day in my regular work. The nearest tree to the wooden wall was a healthy-looking white oak that didn't seem to be infected. At least, I hoped it wasn't. I threw my rope over the lowest branch, cinched my harness tight, and started climbing. The branches held my weight, but as soon as I got about 20 feet up, they started moving. Not dramatically, just small adjustments that threw off my balance and made each handhold uncertain. The tree was infected after all, just not as obviously as the others. I could feel pale shapes moving inside the trunk, trying to anticipate my movements and shake me loose. I climbed faster, using techniques I'd learned in emergency tree removal, getting above the manipulated branches to where the tree was still behaving normally. From 30 feet up, I could see over the wall the larvae had built. Beyond it, the forest looked normal. Regular trees growing in natural patterns, sunlight filtering down in familiar ways. But I could also see what the creatures were really building. Deeper in the forest, maybe a mile from the trail, they'd shaped dozens of trees into a massive cathedral-like structure. Trunks formed pillars, branches created flying buttresses, and the whole thing was hollow in the center, like a vast wooden church. At the heart of it, I could see something pale and enormous moving. The queen, maybe, or whatever was directing this entire operation. I didn't want to find out what they were preparing that space for. The jump from my perch to the top of the wooden wall was about 8 feet. Doable, but risky. If I missed, or if the wall collapsed under my weight, I'd be back on the ground with hundreds of those things crawling all over me. But staying in the tree wasn't an option either. I could feel it starting to hollow itself out beneath me, trying to create a chamber to trap me in. I coiled my rope, took 3 deep breaths, and jumped. I hit the woven branches hard, feeling them bend and crack under my weight. For a terrifying second, I thought the whole wall would collapse and dump me back into the infected area. But the construction held, and I scrambled across the tops of the branches like a bridge, moving as fast as I could toward the other side. The larvae were following me, flowing up through the hollow interiors of their created trees and emerging onto the surface. They moved faster than I expected, their pale bodies stretching and contracting like inchworms but covering ground at an alarming rate. One of them got close enough to grab my ankle as I reached the far edge of the wall. I kicked hard, connecting with its soft body, and it let go with a sound like ripping wet fabric. Then, I was over the edge, dropping down onto normal forest floor on the other side. My ankle throbbed where the thing had grabbed me, and when I looked down, I could see small holes in my jeans where it had tried to burrow through. The truck started on the first try, and I got out of there as fast as the rough access road would allow. In my rearview mirror, I could see the wall of infected trees already beginning to grow taller, reaching up toward the sky like wooden fingers. By the time I reached the main highway, my phone had signal again, though the battery was still nearly dead. I called the state park office and told them Mills was missing, that there'd been some kind of accident on the trail. Didn't mention the larvae or the impossible trees. Who would believe that? They found his truck the next day, parked right where we'd left it, but no sign of Mills himself. The official report listed him as lost in the wilderness, probably fallen into a ravine or taken by a bear. His family got a nice state pension and a folded flag. The Park Service called me a week later to ask about rescheduling the tree removal. I told them I was booked solid through the spring, maybe they should find someone else. They did, brought in a crew from Virginia with bigger equipment and more men. That crew never came back either. The trail's been permanently closed now, officially due to unstable geological conditions. They've got barriers up at all the access points and regular ranger patrols to keep hikers out. But I've heard rumors from other tree services, guys who work the area around the national forest. Trees growing in impossible shapes, they say. Geometric patterns appearing overnight in previously normal woodlands. I still work as an arborist, but I stay close to town now. No more remote jobs, no more state park work, and definitely nothing that involves hiking more than a quarter mile from my truck. Sarah thinks I'm being paranoid, but she wasn't there. She didn't see those pale things reshaping living wood like it was clay, building something vast and alien in the heart of our mountains. Sometimes, when the wind is right and I'm working in the hills around home, I swear I can hear that scraping sound again, fingernails on wood, carving patterns that don't belong in nature. And sometimes, looking up at the tree line in the distance, I think I can see them. Geometric shapes in the canopy, too perfect to be natural, growing a little closer to town each season. I keep my chainsaws sharp and my truck gassed up, just in case. Because whatever those things are building in that wooden cathedral, I have a feeling they're not done yet. And next time, I don't think they'll be content to just let me walk away. I'm 29, and I make my living as a wedding photographer. Not the kind who gets booked for fancy country club receptions or destination weddings in Tuscany. I'm talking about the scrappy freelance work where you're grateful for any couple willing to take a chance on your portfolio. That's how I ended up driving 6 hours into the mountains of West Virginia in October 2023, chasing what seemed like my big break. Sarah Chen had found me through Instagram somehow. She'd messaged, saying she wanted a photographer for her vintage mountain wedding at some historic venue called Moonrise Trail. The pay was double my usual rate, and she specifically mentioned wanting someone who could capture authentic Appalachian atmosphere. I'd grown up in these mountains before moving to the city, so I figured I knew what she meant. Looking back now, I had no idea what I was walking into. The venue was a restored 1800s homestead that you could only reach by hiking a 2-mile trail through the forest. Sarah had booked it for the weekend specifically because, as she put it, modern couples never really commit to each other anymore. She wanted something that felt permanent, traditional, rooted in the land itself. Her fiancé Marcus seemed less enthusiastic about the whole thing, but he went along with it. They'd met in grad school, both studying folklore and cultural anthropology, which probably explained the obsession with historical authenticity. I drove up Friday morning to scout locations and set up equipment before the wedding party arrived Saturday. The trail started at an old logging road about 20 minutes outside a town called Beckley Hollow, population maybe 300 if you counted the dogs. The woman who owned the venue, Mrs. Blackwood, met me at the trailhead. She had to be in her 70s, but she moved through those mountains like someone half her age. "You're the picture taker," she said, not really a question. "Sarah mentioned you grew up around here." "About an hour south," I told her. "My family's been in these parts for generations." She nodded like this satisfied some requirement I didn't know I was being tested for. "Good. The trail responds better to mountain folk. Always has." The hike up was incredible from a photography standpoint. Every 50 yards offered another perfect shot, waterfalls cascading over moss-covered rocks, meadows framed by autumn maples, old stone bridges that looked like they'd been built by fairy tale characters. I took test shots as we walked, getting a feel for how the light filtered through the canopy. That's when I first noticed something odd with my camera. I was using a vintage Nikon F3 that I'd bought specifically for this job, thinking it would complement the rustic aesthetic Sarah wanted. But in every shot, there seemed to be people in the background that I hadn't seen with my naked eye. Figures in old-fashioned clothing, long dresses, suspenders, wide-brimmed hats standing along the trail or gathered near the scenic spots. At first I assumed it was some kind of lens flare or maybe artifacts from the film processing. The camera was old enough to have quirks. "Is this a popular hiking trail?" I asked Mrs. Blackwood as we passed another perfect photo spot where my camera had captured what looked like a Victorian-era family having a picnic. "Oh yes," she said. "Folks have been walking this path for more than a century and a half. It has what you might call good energy for special occasions." The venue itself was stunning. The original homestead had been lovingly restored, complete with a covered porch where the ceremony would take place and gardens that looked like they'd been tended continuously since the 1800s. Mrs. Blackwood showed me where to set up my equipment and gave me permission to explore the grounds for more photo opportunities. That's when the real weirdness started. I was taking practice shots of the ceremony area when I noticed that my photos were showing not just the empty venue, but what appeared to be a full wedding party from a completely different time period. Through the camera lens, I could see a bride in a Victorian wedding dress standing exactly where Sarah would stand tomorrow, surrounded by guests in period costume. The groom wore a black suit with tails, and everyone looked like they'd stepped out of a daguerreotype. I lowered the camera and looked directly at the spot. Nothing. Just empty wooden floorboards and the folding chairs Mrs. Blackwood had set up for tomorrow's guests. But when I raised the camera again, there they were, a complete 19th century wedding frozen in the middle of their vows. "Interesting old camera you've got there, Mrs. Blackwood said from behind me. I jumped. I hadn't heard her approach. "Yeah, it's picking up some strange reflections or something. Probably needs to be serviced." She came over and looked at the back of the camera where I had the digital preview screen. Her face didn't change as she studied the image, showing both time periods overlapping. "That's the McCreary wedding," she said matter-of-factly. "June 15th, 1847. Beautiful ceremony. They were so happy." I stared at her. "I'm sorry? What?" "Your camera's working just fine, honey. It's the trail. This whole area preserves special moments, weddings in particular. Every couple who's been married here becomes part of the family, you might say. They never really leave." I thought she was speaking metaphorically, maybe talking about some local tradition or the emotional significance of the place. It wasn't until I kept taking pictures that I realized she meant it literally. Every shot revealed another layer of the past, different couples, different time periods, all occupying the same space. I had photos showing weddings from the 1,850 seconds, the 1,920 seconds, the 1,960 seconds, even what looked like the 1,990 seconds based on the fashion. All of them happening simultaneously in my camera's view. Mrs. Blackwood explained that the venue had hosted weddings continuously since 1847, when her ancestor Jeremiah Blackwood first built the homestead. "Every couple who marries here stays connected to this place forever," she said. "Their love feeds the land, and the land keeps them alive in return. It's a beautiful arrangement." The way she said it made my skin crawl, but I told myself this was just local folklore, the kind of stories that develop around old places. Mountain people were always attributing supernatural properties to geographic features. My grandmother used to say similar things about certain hollows and ridgelines back home. That night, I stayed in a small cabin about a mile down the trail. Mrs. Blackwood had recommended it, saying the owner was sympathetic to the trail's nature. I spent hours reviewing the photos I'd taken, trying to make sense of what my camera was capturing. The historical figures weren't just posed for wedding photos, they were moving, interacting, going through the full motions of their ceremonies. If I took multiple shots in sequence, I could see the progression of their vows, their first kiss, their celebration. The technology geek in me was fascinated. Whatever was happening here could revolutionize wedding photography. Imagine being able to show couples their ceremony layered with the romantic history of their venue. Sarah would love this artistic effect, even if I had no idea how to explain the technical aspects. Saturday morning, the modern wedding party arrived right on schedule. Sarah looked radiant in a vintage-style dress she'd had custom-made to match 1800s patterns. Marcus seemed nervous, but happy. Their families and friends, about 30 people total, made the hike up in good spirits, joking about getting their exercise before the reception. I started shooting as soon as Sarah began getting ready in the cabin's back room. That's when I noticed something that made my hands shake as I adjusted the camera settings. Through the lens, I could see two brides getting ready in the same space, Sarah in her 2023 dress and a woman in an 1847 gown. They were occupying the exact same spot, moving in similar patterns, but from completely different centuries. As I kept shooting, more historical figures appeared in the frame. Every photo showed multiple wedding parties layered on top of each other, decades and centuries colliding in the same geographic space. The effect was initially beautiful, like a visual representation of enduring love and tradition. But then I started paying attention to the expressions on the historical figures' faces. They weren't happy, they looked trapped. The Victorian bride kept reaching toward the camera with desperate eyes. A couple from what looked like the 1,930 seconds seemed to be screaming, though I couldn't hear them. A 1,960 seconds wedding party appeared to be trying to run from something. Their faces twisted in terror. Whatever was keeping these people connected to this place, it wasn't the romantic, eternal love that Mrs. Blackwood had described. The modern ceremony began at 2 p.m. as planned. Sarah and Marcus exchanged vows on the covered porch while I documented everything through my camera. But something strange was happening to the present-day wedding party. Sarah's voice started changing as she spoke, her vows, her modern, casual tone shifting into something more formal and archaic. She began using phrases like "in sickness" and "in health" in the old-fashioned pronunciation, and her posture became more rigid, like a Victorian woman. Marcus was changing too. His nervous energy disappeared, replaced by the stern, stoic bearing of a 19th century man. He stood straighter, spoke in clipped, formal sentences, and looked at Sarah with an intensity that seemed wrong for his personality. I looked around at the wedding guests and saw that none of them seemed to notice these changes. They were all smiling and recording with their phones like everything was perfectly normal. But through my camera lens, I could see that they were also being influenced by the historical figures. Modern guests were adopting the posture and behavior of past wedding attendees, slowly merging with the ghostly celebration. Mrs. Blackwood stood at the back of the gathering, watching everything with satisfaction. When she caught me staring, she smiled and mouthed, "Beautiful ceremony, isn't it?" That's when I understood what was really happening. This wasn't just a venue that preserved romantic history, it was a trap. Every couple who got married here became permanently bound to this place, their souls or energy, or whatever you want to call it, absorbed into the landscape. They were forced to reenact their wedding ceremony over and over again, for eternity, feeding whatever supernatural force kept this place running. And now Sarah and Marcus were being pulled into the same fate. I wanted to stop the ceremony, to warn them what was happening, but I found that I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, and my hands kept operating the camera automatically, documenting their transformation into just another historical layer of trapped souls. That's when I noticed that my camera equipment was changing too. The modern digital elements were being replaced by vintage photography gear that seemed to appear out of thin air. My camera bag now contained glass plates and chemical processing equipment. A large, old-fashioned tripod had materialized beside me. Mrs. Blackwood approached during the ring exchange. "Every wedding needs a photographer," she whispered. "That's why we called you here. The previous one finally wore out after documenting ceremonies since 1923. You'll do much better, I think. Mountain folk always do." I tried to speak, to move, to do anything, but my body was no longer under my control. I was becoming part of the venue's permanent staff, doomed to photograph the same ceremony over and over again as new couples were lured in and absorbed into this supernatural marriage mill. But then something unexpected happened. Sarah, even as she was being possessed by the Victorian bride Elizabeth, seemed to recognize what was happening. Her anthropology training must have kicked in, because she started fighting against the spiritual influence. In the middle of her vows, she broke character and screamed, "David, something's wrong, help us." That moment of modern awareness broke whatever spell was holding me in place. I raised my camera and, instead of documenting the ceremony, I aimed it directly at Mrs. Blackwood and hit the flash. She shrieked as the bright light hit her, and something incredible happened. In that split second of illumination, I could see her true form through the camera lens. She wasn't a 70-year-old woman, she was ancient, centuries old, her skin like dried leather and her eyes completely black. The flash photography seemed to hurt her, revealing her real nature and disrupting her control over the area. I kept taking flash photos, one after another, and with each burst of light, Mrs. Blackwood aged visibly. Her carefully maintained appearance crumbled, showing her true form as something that had been feeding off wedding energy for over a century and a half. The historical wedding parties in my photos began to glow brighter, as if the flash was freeing them from their eternal bondage. "Stop, Mrs. Blackwood commanded, but her voice now sounded like wind through dry leaves. "You don't understand what you're doing. Without the ceremonies, without the energy, this place will die." "Good," I said, and took another flash photo. With that final burst of light, Mrs. Blackwood crumbled to dust. The moment she disappeared, every historical figure visible through my camera began walking toward a bright light that appeared at the edge of the photo frame. They looked peaceful, finally free to move on after decades or centuries of imprisonment. The modern wedding party snapped back to awareness, like they were waking up from a dream. Sarah and Marcus looked around in confusion, no longer speaking in archaic language or standing with Victorian posture. The guests started asking what had happened, why everyone had felt so strange for a moment. "We need to leave," I told them. "Right now. This place isn't what we thought it was." I didn't explain everything, how could I? But something in my voice convinced them. We packed up quickly and hiked down the trail as fast as we could manage. Behind us, I could hear the old homestead beginning to collapse, the wood groaning and cracking as whatever supernatural force had maintained it finally died with Mrs. Blackwood. When we reached the bottom of the trail, Sarah and Marcus decided to postpone their wedding indefinitely. They needed time to process what had happened, though none of us could fully explain the experience in rational terms. They thanked me for somehow saving them, though I'm still not sure how I knew what to do in that moment. The strange thing is, when I developed the photos from that day, most of them came out completely normal. Just regular wedding shots, with no historical figures or supernatural elements visible. The only image that preserved any evidence of what happened was a single photo showing all the trapped couples walking toward that bright light, finally free after so many years of imprisonment. That photo made me famous, actually. Photography magazines called it a groundbreaking artistic technique, this idea of layering different time periods in a single image. I never told them how I really captured it. The photo went viral online, and suddenly I had more wedding bookings than I could handle. But I don't photograph mountain venues anymore. I stick to city locations, modern spaces with no history to speak of. Sarah and Marcus eventually did get married in a courthouse in Pittsburgh, with just their families present. They asked me to shoot it, and those photos came out perfectly normal. I still have that one supernatural photo hanging in my studio. Clients always ask about it, fascinated by the technique. I tell them it's a family secret, something my grandmother taught me about, capturing the spirit of a place. If I'm being honest, sometimes late at night when I'm editing photos, I think I can see figures in the backgrounds of my images that weren't there when I took them. Not historical figures this time, but something else. Something that might have noticed what I did at Moonrise Trail and decided I'm worth keeping an eye on. I try not to think about it too much. I focus on the normal couples, the normal venues, the normal job of documenting people's happiest day. But every now and then, when a client mentions wanting something authentic or historically significant, I politely refer them to someone else. Because some traditions, I learned, are better left undisturbed. My name's Jessica Martinez, and at 31, I've been a home health aide for 8 years here in eastern Kentucky. I grew up in these mountains, third generation on my mama's side, so I thought I knew every holler and ridge from here to the Tennessee line. My great-grandmother used to tell stories about places you shouldn't go, springs that weren't meant for drinking, trails that led to things older than the Cherokee settlements. I figured they were just mountain tales, the kind every family passes down to keep kids from wandering too far into the deep woods. I should have listened to those stories. See, being a home health aide isn't just a job when you're from here. It's a calling. These old folks, they're the last connection to how things used to be before the coal companies and the government came through and changed everything. My clients aren't just patients, they're the keepers of our history. Mrs. Whitaker taught me to identify medicinal plants that grow wild in the hollows. Old Pete Morrison showed me how to read weather patterns in the way smoke rises from chimneys. When you grow up poor in Appalachia, you learn that knowledge is survival, and the elderly folks have knowledge that can't be found in any textbook. That's why I didn't hesitate when Linda from the agency called about a special assignment. "It's Ruby Patterson," she said, and I recognized the name immediately. The Pattersons had been on these mountains since before Kentucky was even a state. They owned land up near Healing Springs that had been in the family for 6 generations. Ruby was the last of them, never married, no children. Local legend said the Pattersons were what folks call gifted. They could find water with willow branches, predict harsh winters by watching bird behavior, and cure ailments with plants that grew wild on their property. Ruby's been asking specifically for someone local, Linda explained, someone who understands mountain ways. It's a week-long assignment, live-in care, and the pay is. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "Well, it's more than you usually make in a month, Jessica. But there's a catch. Her place isn't accessible by road anymore. Old logging trail washed out years ago. It's a 3-mile hike up Healing Springs Trail, and the family says she's going through some kind of medical crisis." The Patterson land had been off-limits to hikers for as long as I could remember. Not officially. There were no government signs or fences, but locals knew better. Too many people had gotten lost on those trails, turned around in broad daylight, and wandered for hours before finding their way back down the mountain. My daddy used to say the land itself didn't want strangers, that it had ways of confusing outsiders and leading them in circles until they gave up and left. But Ruby Patterson had asked for me by name, which was unusual. I'd never met the woman, but she somehow knew about my work, knew I was from a local family, knew I'd understand whatever situation she was dealing with. The money was too good to pass up. My mama needed surgery for her diabetes complications, and my own health insurance barely covered basic checkups. Sometimes you take the assignments that scare you, because life doesn't give you much choice. The trailhead was exactly where I remembered from childhood hiking trips with my grandfather. He'd brought me up this way once when I was maybe 8 years old, but we'd never gone more than a mile before he turned us around. "That's far enough, little one," he'd said, and something in his voice made me not argue. Now, standing at the same spot 23 years later, I could feel what he'd sensed back then, a wrongness in the air that made my skin crawl. Ruby's nephews were waiting for me with genuine pack mules, not the horses I'd expected. These were mountain-bred animals with the thick coats and steady temperament that come from generations of working steep, rocky terrain. The men introduced themselves as Thomas and William Patterson, Ruby's sister's boys, though they looked to be in their 50s and had the weathered faces of people who'd spent their lives doing hard outdoor work. "Aunt Ruby's been different since she got sick," Thomas said as we loaded my medical supplies onto the pack animals. Doctor told her she had maybe 6 months. That was near 5 years ago. She stopped coming down the mountain after that, started living off what she could grow and catch. We bring supplies up every few months, but she insists she doesn't need much help anymore. He paused, adjusting the straps on one of the pack saddles. Thing is, last time we saw her, she looked healthier than she has in decades. But she keeps saying she's changing, that she needs someone with medical knowledge to document what's happening to her. William, the younger brother, seemed more nervous about the whole situation. She made us promise to find someone local, he said. Someone who wouldn't run off at the first sign of, well, mountain strangeness. Ruby's always been different, even as a kid. She could find lost animals, predict when storms were coming days ahead of the weather service. But lately, when we visit, it's like she's becoming something else entirely. The hike up Healing Springs Trail was harder than I'd expected. The path was clear enough, worn smooth by generations of Patterson family members making this journey. But it felt wrong somehow. The forest was too quiet, no bird calls, no insect buzzing. Even our footsteps seemed muffled by the thick canopy overhead. The pack mules grew increasingly nervous as we climbed higher, their ears constantly swiveling like they were listening for something that never quite materialized. About halfway up, we reached the spring that gave the trail its name. It bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks, forming a small pool before flowing down the mountain as a narrow creek. The water was crystal clear, but something about it made me deeply uneasy. It was too clear, like looking through glass, and when the sunlight hit it at certain angles, there were colors in the water that shouldn't have been there. Deep blues and greens that seemed to shift and move independently of the current. That's where Aunt Ruby gets her drinking water, Thomas mentioned, but he didn't look at the spring directly. Always has, even before she got sick. Says it tastes better than anything that comes from a well. I knelt down and cupped some in my hands, thinking it might be nice to splash on my face after the long hike. The water felt strange against my skin, almost oily, and it left a metallic taste in the air that lingered long after I'd wiped my hands dry. Ruby's farmhouse sat in a clearing that felt carved out of the forest itself. It was larger than I'd expected, probably built sometime in the early 1900s, but maintained with the kind of care that comes from generations of the same family living in the same place. Solar panels on the roof, a small wind generator, even a satellite dish that looked relatively new. The Patterson family might have been mountain people, but they weren't primitive. Ruby's probably resting, William said as we unloaded the supplies. She sleeps a lot during the day now, says her body is working hard on something she can't explain. Just knock on her bedroom door when you're ready to meet her. We'll head back down before dark. Don't like being on this trail after sunset. Both men seemed eager to leave, and they barely said goodbye before starting back down the mountain with the empty pack animals. I spent the afternoon getting familiar with the house and organizing my medical supplies in what used to be a formal dining room. Ruby had converted most of the downstairs into a kind of research area, with tables covered in notebooks, medical journals, and what looked like scientific equipment that definitely hadn't come from any medical supply catalog. There were microscopes, pH testing kits, centrifuge machines, and glass containers filled with liquids in colors I didn't recognize. The walls were covered with hand-drawn charts, tracking what looked like biological processes, cell division patterns, temperature variations, chemical compositions. Some of the handwriting was definitely Ruby's, but there were older entries in different scripts, as if multiple generations of Patterson family members had been documenting something happening on this property for decades. One chart, dated from the 1942, was titled Spring Water Analysis, Cellular Regeneration Properties, and included detailed sketches of what looked like microscopic organisms. I first met Ruby around dinner time, and nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. The woman who emerged from the back bedroom looked maybe 50 years old, with thick gray hair, clear skin, and the kind of robust health that you see in people half her age. She moved with perfect balance and coordination, and when she shook my hand, her grip was stronger than mine had ever been. "You must be Jessica," she said, and her voice had the kind of clarity and strength that comes from good lung capacity and excellent health. "I appreciate you making the journey. I know the trail can be unsettling for people who aren't used to mountain ways." There was something in her eyes that reminded me of my great-grandmother, an intensity that suggested she could see things other people missed. But there were details that weren't quite right. Her skin had a slight gray tint that became more noticeable in certain light, and when she moved, I could see what looked like raised patterns under the surface, almost like veins but too geometric to be part of normal human circulation. Her fingernails were thicker than normal and had taken on a yellowish color that reminded me unpleasantly of old bones. "I suppose my nephews told you I'm supposed to be dying," Ruby said as she showed me around the kitchen. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed 5 years ago. Doctor Hammond in town gave me 6 months if I was lucky." She paused at the window that looked out toward the spring. "But I've been drinking water from our family spring my whole life. And when the cancer got bad, something in that water started, helping me in ways the doctors can't explain." That evening, Ruby showed me the notebooks that documented her condition over the past 5 years. The early entries read like the journal of a woman preparing to die. Pain levels, medication schedules, preparations for the end. But somewhere around month 8, the tone changed completely. "Pain stopped today." Read one entry. "First time in months I could eat solid food without nausea." Energy returning, but something else is happening too. Skin feels different. Vision changing. The later entries became increasingly detailed and scientific. Ruby had been tracking her body temperature, which had stabilized at exactly 96.2 degrees and never varied. Her heart rate held steady at 64 beats per minute. Her blood pressure remained constant at 110/70. Most unsettling were the photographs she'd taken of her own arms and legs, showing the progression of the raised patterns under her skin. What had started as faint lines had developed into complex geometric networks that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. "The cancer is completely gone," Ruby explained as I studied the journal. "Has been for 3 years now. But whatever cured it is continuing to change me. I've been documenting everything because I think this is something that's been happening to my family for generations. We've always lived longer than most people, always been healthier, but I think I'm the first one to actually track what the spring water does to human biology." I spent my first night in the guest bedroom trying to process everything I'd seen. Ruby's vital signs were impossibly stable for someone her age, and the patterns under her skin didn't match any medical condition I'd studied. But she was clearly intelligent, articulate, and genuinely interested in understanding what was happening to her from a scientific perspective. Whatever was going on, it didn't feel like mental illness or delusion. Around midnight, I heard Ruby moving around the house, and when I looked out my window, I saw her walking around the property in complete darkness, without any kind of flashlight. She moved with perfect confidence, never stumbling or hesitating, examining trees and stopping occasionally to kneel down and touch the ground. Her movements were purposeful, but alien, like she was following patterns or routines that made sense to her but would be incomprehensible to normal humans. The next morning, I began a formal medical assessment, and that's when I realized how far from normal Ruby's condition had progressed. Her reflexes were hyper-responsive to the point of being almost violent. When I tested her knee-jerk response, her leg kicked so hard it nearly knocked me over. Her pupils dilated and contracted much faster than human normal, and her peripheral vision seemed to extend well beyond what should have been possible. "How long do you think this process will continue?" I asked as we sat on the front porch after the examination. Ruby stared out at the mountains for a long time before answering, and I got the distinct impression she was consulting with something I couldn't see or hear. "I think I'm approaching the final stage," she said finally. "The changes are accelerating, and my body is stabilizing into whatever it's becoming. Maybe another week or 2. She turned to look at me directly, and her eyes had taken on a reflective quality that reminded me of animal eyes caught in headlights. "That's why I asked for someone to be here. Whatever I'm becoming, I want the knowledge preserved. The Patterson family has been guardians of that spring for 6 generations, but I'm the last of us. Someone needs to understand what we've been protecting." On my 3rd day, Ruby took me down to the basement and showed me something that completely reframed everything I thought I understood about her condition. The entire space had been converted into a kind of museum, with glass cases containing what looked like complete layers of human skin, each one labeled with dates going back decades. Every 18 months or so, the old skin separates from the new layer underneath, Ruby explained matter-of-factly. "It's like molting, but much more gradual and controlled." She guided me to a case containing the most recent specimens, and I could see the clear progression from normal human skin to something that was definitely not human anymore. The latest samples were gray-green in color, with a texture that looked more like leather or scales than human flesh. Under magnification, I could see that the cellular structure was completely different, more densely packed, with geometric patterns that seemed to serve some unknown biological function. "This is what my great-great-grandmother looked like when she passed," Ruby said, showing me a daguerreotype photograph from the 1880 seconds. The woman in the picture had the same reflective eyes and gray-tinted skin that I was seeing in Ruby, but more advanced. Her features were still recognizably human, but there was something fundamentally alien about her proportions and posture. That night, I tried calling Ruby's nephews, using the old rotary phone in the kitchen, but the line was completely dead. My cell phone had no signal anywhere on the property, which Ruby explained was normal for this elevation. For the first time since arriving, I felt genuinely isolated and cut off from the outside world. If something went wrong up here, if Ruby had some kind of medical emergency related to her transformation, I had no way to call for help. On my fourth morning, I noticed small patches of skin on my own arms that looked different from normal, slightly grayish and thicker than the surrounding area. They appeared in places where I'd been handling Ruby's research materials or touching surfaces in her house. At first, I thought it might be some kind of allergic reaction, but when I showed them to Ruby, her expression became deeply serious. "It's starting in you too," she said quietly. "The process spreads through prolonged contact with affected individuals or materials that have absorbed the spring water compounds. I should have warned you, but I wasn't certain it would happen so quickly." She examined the patches on my arms with the focused attention of a scientist studying an important specimen. "You have a choice to make now, Jessica. You can fight it, try to stop the spread, but that requires extreme measures, or you can let it happen and become something new." The next few hours were the most difficult of my life. Ruby showed me her research into what she called process reversal, a chemical treatment she'd developed that could halt and reverse the transformation, but only in the very early stages. The treatment involved a combination of industrial-grade acids and alkaline solutions that would essentially burn the changed cells out of my system. "It's extremely painful," Ruby warned, "and there's no guarantee it will work completely. But if you wait much longer, the process becomes irreversible." I made the hardest decision I've ever had to make. As a medical professional, I couldn't allow an unknown biological agent to transform my body, no matter how beneficial Ruby claimed it was. "I need to try the reversal treatment," I told her. Ruby looked disappointed but not surprised. "I understand," she said. "But you should know that the chemicals required for your treatment are toxic to advanced stage subjects like myself. Just having them in the house will make me very ill." We set up the treatment in the shed behind the house, far enough from the main building that Ruby could avoid direct exposure to the chemical compounds. The process took 18 hours and was the most agonizing experience of my life. Every cell in my body felt like it was being torn apart and rebuilt. Ruby monitored my vital signs and adjusted the chemical concentrations, but I could see that even being near the treatment area was making her sick. Her perfect health began to deteriorate rapidly, and by morning, she looked frail and elderly for the first time since I'd met her. "The reversal compounds are poison to what I've become," Ruby explained as I recovered from the treatment. "My biological systems can't survive exposure to them. I'm dying, Jessica, and it's going to happen quickly now." She was right. Over the next 12 hours, I watched a woman who had seemed impossibly healthy waste away, as if 5 years of postponed aging were catching up with her all at once. Ruby died peacefully on my 6th day there, and I buried her in the small family cemetery behind the house, according to her instructions. Before she passed, she made me promise to document everything I'd witnessed and to take tissue samples from the spring for scientific analysis. "The process isn't evil," she told me in her final hours. "It's just evolution, faster than nature usually allows. Someone needs to understand what's possible, even if the world isn't ready for it yet." I hiked back down the mountain with sample containers filled with spring water, detailed photographs of Ruby's transformation, and copies of the Patterson family research going back 6 generations. I was convinced that the medical community needed to know about this phenomenon, that it could represent some kind of breakthrough in cellular regeneration and longevity research. But when I brought the samples to the regional medical center, Every test came back normal, just mountain spring water with typical mineral content. The photographs I'd taken showed only an elderly woman with normal aging patterns. Even my own medical documentation read like the confused observations of someone under extreme stress. It was as if the evidence was somehow protecting itself, becoming invisible to outside scrutiny. 3 weeks later, representatives from the Centers for Disease Control arrived to investigate my reports. But when we hiked up to Ruby's property, we found the house empty and abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. The basement museum was gone, the research laboratory had vanished, and even Ruby's grave was missing from the family cemetery. The investigators were polite but skeptical, and after their examination turned up nothing unusual, I was quietly reassigned and advised to take some vacation time. I still work as a home health aide, but I refuse any assignments that involve isolated mountain properties. The treatment completely eliminated any sign of the transformation from my system, and regular blood tests confirm that I'm biologically normal. But sometimes, when I'm working with terminal cancer patients who've exhausted all conventional treatments, I find myself thinking about alternatives that medical science isn't ready to understand. What haunts me most isn't what happened to Ruby, but what I learned about the Patterson family history. 6 generations of people who lived longer than normal, stayed healthier than their neighbors, and gradually became something other than human. The spring wasn't a recent discovery, it was a family inheritance, passed down through generations who understood that some knowledge is too dangerous for the outside world. I've done research since then, diving into local historical records and family genealogies. The Patterson family has been in these mountains since the 1700s, and there are patterns in their history that are hard to ignore. They rarely died of disease, often lived past 100, and had a reputation for being able to cure ailments that baffled doctors. But they also had a pattern of disappearing from public records in their advanced years, as if they were choosing to fade away from human society entirely. The most disturbing discovery came from a conversation with my great-grandmother before she passed last winter. When I mentioned the Patterson name, her eyes went wide with something between fear and understanding. "The spring folk," she whispered. "My grandmother used to warn me about them. Said they weren't fully human anymore, that they'd made some kind of bargain with something old that lived in the deep water." According to family stories that go back to the Cherokee settlements, there have always been springs in these mountains that changed people who drank from them. The native tribes considered them sacred but dangerous, places where the boundary between human and something else became thin. European settlers either avoided these areas entirely or, in a few cases, like the Patterson family, chose to become guardians of whatever power existed there. I never went back to Healing Springs Trail, and I never will. But I think about Ruby Patterson more often than I should, especially late at night when I'm lying in bed and can almost hear the sound of that impossibly clear water bubbling up from somewhere deep underground. I wonder if she was the last of her kind, or if there are others scattered throughout these mountains, living in places too remote for casual hikers to find. The mountains keep their secrets well, and maybe that's for the best. There are powers in these hills that predate human civilization, forces that offer transformation at prices most people aren't prepared to pay. Ruby Patterson made her choice and lived with the consequences for 5 years, becoming something more and less than human, before finally accepting that some bridges can't be uncrossed. I made my choice too, choosing to remain human rather than become whatever she was becoming. Most days, I'm certain I made the right decision. But sometimes, when I'm treating patients whose bodies are failing them despite all the miracles of modern medicine, I remember the strength in Ruby's grip and the perfect clarity in her transformed eyes, and I wonder what I might have gained if I'd been brave enough to let the process continue. The forbidden trails of Appalachia lead to more than just remote cabins and abandoned settlements. They lead to possibilities that challenge everything we think we know about the boundaries of human existence. Ruby Patterson discovered one of those possibilities and documented it with the dedication of a true scientist. Whether her transformation was evolution, contamination, or something else entirely, it represents a path that most people will never have the chance to choose. I was offered that choice, and I chose to remain human. I'll live with that decision for the rest of my life, never knowing for certain whether I saved myself or missed the chance to become something extraordinary. The spring water still flows down from Healing Springs, carrying whatever power the Patterson family guarded for 6 generations. It's still there, waiting for the next person who's desperate enough or curious enough to drink from waters that promise transformation at the cost of humanity itself. That's my story, and I've never told it to anyone before now. Draw whatever conclusions you want, but if you're ever hiking in the deep mountains of eastern Kentucky and you come across a spring that flows too clear and tastes like metal and promises, do yourself a favor and keep walking. Some knowledge comes at prices that can't be undone, and some transformations lead to places where humans weren't meant to go.